This time on Poll Hub, Joe Biden's very good, super duper week just keeps giving him wins. But will it make any difference in November? Magic 8 Ball says, no, we don't use that. We're looking at the polls to see what Americans think. Then, why the media has taken such a beating in the polls. Americans say they have little trust or faith in the press in general, but what about specifically the website or news channel that they follow? Then, as summer heads to an end, how's your sunscreen supply holding up? Our fun fact looks back to see what's changed in how Americans use this stuff. It's actually kind of surprising. We'll get to it, so stick around. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Depp.
I'm Barbara Carvalho.
And I'm Lee Baringoff.
Well, it's been quite a 10-day stretch for President Biden, almost feeling like he may be on track for the Democrats. Let's see, we've got quite a long list here. The Senate passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which is Build Back Better, just this past weekend. The House is set to vote this coming Friday. And if all goes well, the president could be signing it this weekend. He also signed the CHIPS and Science Act into law on Tuesday. This is the act that invests money into the production of American-made semiconductors to tackle some of those supply chain problems that we've been seeing over the last months. Also, he signed the PACT Act into law on Wednesday. That was the toxic burn pits bill for veterans. And he also got some good news from the jobs numbers. Unemployment is the lowest it has been in more than 50 years at 3.5%. We've got more people working now than in any point in American history. And gas prices have fell for the 7th consecutive week, and on average are below $4 a gallon nationally. So a lot of good news for the White House, but are Americans noticing?
Well, I did see that all the Republican candidates for House and Senate have resigned and are running, and that they are also ceding the second term to Joe Biden based on your synopsis of some of his recent successes. I don't know. Maybe that wasn't real. I'm making it because Jay.
I mean, part of this is what are Americans paying attention to? So one of the things that we always track is the approval rating. We haven't really seen a lot of new approval rating numbers. There's been one poll just this week on Wednesday of this week, Morning Consult and Politico, who are out almost every week polling. And the favorability rating for Biden's approval rating, I should say, is 39%. That's within the range of where they've been for a couple of weeks. What we've seen, though, in the trend in the approval rating is that while it has come back up in our poll slightly, he's still at or below 40% in most polls. So maybe this isn't baked in yet. We'll see. Usually these things take a little bit of time. But the other thing is, what are people paying attention to? I think that's what we really want to look at here. That same Morning Consult political poll found that the top issues of Americans, and we saw this in our earlier polls, everybody's seeing this. Top issue, economic issues, 45%. Women's issues, which includes abortion, 13%. Security issues, 11%. Senior issues, energy issues, healthcare issues, education. All of those things that people like about these bills that he signed, that Americans support, and most of them are in favor. Most parts of it all comes back to the economy, stupid.
Well, is Joe Biden in the White House?
I wasn't calling you stupidly,
Okay.
No, but hang on a second, because I mean, I think that is a really important point, Jay, because although the economy, some of the numbers seem to be changing direction. I mean, also inflation declined last month. Still, I mean, it's still very high on average for the year. So it's not like people aren't noticing that we're still paying a lot more for food and even gasoline, even though that has come down. But most goods and services have increased, and I suspect we're not going to be seeing any decreases lately, coming in the future. So what does this though mean for our politics? And we're going into the midterms. Is the White House actually peaking too soon?
Boy, I tell you, let's race all the tapes that were done the last 6 months that people used. The White House might make the argument that when things are bad, they get the blame, and when things turn around and get a little bit better, there's crickets out there, and no one hears much. So,
and every White House says that. I mean, to be fair,
standard White House pitter patter. So, when you look at the summation of what he's done in the 2 years in office, there's a lot to be said, and it can even go back to the infrastructure, the COVID rescue bill. I mean, he's had some shortcomings, but the Build Back Better didn't make it through. But now the Inflation Reduction Act sort of takes care of a lot of things, including climate change, which is a big deal. So we know, however, that the president's approval rating doesn't seem tied to the congressional generic questions. We've talked about that before, that Democrats may run ahead of Joe Biden's approval rating in the midterms. They certainly need to, because he's not going to go from 40% to 50% in the next 6 weeks. It's just not going to happen. He may get up a little bit, but the question is, what about mobilization? What about turnout? And does Joe Biden become less of a liability? I think he's less of a liability because they have a record to point to. And yes, they are peaking at sort of the right time on this.
But talk about the generic ballot, because I think that's really important. We were among the first polls to show it flipping back towards Democrats. Everybody's showing that now, pretty much. Not every poll, but most of them. What does this tell you?
So this is your general question on, are you going to vote, that everybody asks, are you going to vote for a Democrat or Republican in your congressional district? And sort of like a general barometer of kind of like the party mood out there. And the sense of that the Democrats have to be up certainly on this question. And they're running much higher in that answer response than Joe Biden's approval rating. So in a sense, the president can have a low approval rating in his party and might still survive the midterm elections. And right now, the Democrats are pretty optimistic about maintaining the Senate. And there's even some talk for the first time about the House. This may swing back between now and November against them. But right now, since June 24th and the Supreme Court ruling, the mobilization has been going in the Democrats' favor. And now with this legislative, they can say, look, we got a 50-50 Senate and look what we've accomplished. And there's something he can say now, which he wasn't able to say at all.
Well, and it's what all those candidates on the trail can say. I mean, I think that's more to the point. He's not on the ballot, or at least Democrats hope he's not on the ballot, right?
And also, I would just say, it's typically a referendum on the president's first 2 years in office. Right now, it's starting to look like a referendum on former President Trump. And for the Democrats, that's good news.
Well, the Republicans, though, have been making the economy the issue. They have been focusing totally on inflation and the pain that Americans are feeling in many aspects of their lives. If these trends were to continue, does that undermine that argument? Or do you think that the economy will still be the big issue?
Remember 1992, the economy was actually improving pretty markedly as we got to the 1992 election, but Bill Clinton was running on George Bush can't handle the economy. He's out of touch. He doesn't get it. And Americans weren't looking at the numbers. They weren't looking at the facts and figures. They were feeling what they were feeling about George Bush. And Bill Clinton won, at least in part. I mean, not the only reason, but people, if you look at the opinion polls from that era, getting right up to election day, people were still unhappy about the economy, despite the fact that it was improving. I don't think facts necessarily get in the way of a feeling.
As our partner, Mary
Or
Griffith,
perception, as we like to say in
I was just going
Poland.
to say, Mary Griffith will always tell you that politics is all about perception. And I agree with Mary on a lot of things, and this is one of them.
We wanted to talk about something we talk a lot on this show about, which is the media, but specifically Americans' feelings and views about the media. We've talked a lot on this show about how Americans have lost a lot of trust and faith in institutions, most notably the Supreme Court, the big drop recently in that. But the media has never been really high up there, but there's been a big decline recently over the last few years. And so we want to talk about this with Dr. Kevin Lerner. He's Associate Professor of Journalism and the Chair of the Department of Communications here at Marist. He also wrote a book, Provoking the Press, More Magazine and the Crisis of Confidence in American Journalism. Kevin, welcome.
Thank you, Jay.
So as I noted, this is not necessarily new. As a journalist, I recall the inside joke in the newsroom was we're about as well regarded as lawyers among the public. Has it gotten worse? The perception is, I think, and the polling shows it has, but why has it gotten worse, if you think it has?
And I think the perception has gotten worse, but I actually think the better comparison isn't to lawyers, but to Congress. As I think Barbara and Lee have probably seen in polling, if you ask people their perceptions of Congress, they think it stinks. If you ask them the perceptions of their member of Congress, they love the guy. Right. And I think there's some of that going on in the polling of the quote unquote media as well, in that people tend to like the publications they follow. They trust the ones they trust. The rest of it is junk. In terms of why I think it's changed over time, or at least perceptions have changed over time, I think the biggest contributing factor is what you could look at as the decline of the mass media. I'm a historian of journalism, and looking at a bigger historical view, what I would call the mass media era, which I think is going to turn out to be a historical anomaly in the way that the press is regarded. US. I'm 45 years old. And for me, there was a mass media when I started paying attention to the media. My parents' generation is the same way. They grew up with a mass media. By the time they were cognizant of what was going on, they could watch Walter Cronkite on CBS News at night. And there was this sort of, at least for many people, a mainstream media. But really, prior to World War II, that didn't exist. There were very few national publications. It was really limited to magazines. Radio networks they were networks, but you were broadcasting locally. And your newspaper, if you look at the title of just about every newspaper, it has the name of a city, right? And that's because you were getting the news from your city, even the national news. The Cleveland Plain Dealer would have a Washington correspondent. So I think in some sense, everybody who is alive today thinks the mass media is the status quo. But really, prior to World War II, it wasn't. There was no national media. And so I think the sort of mainstream, tell it like it is, view from nowhere kind of journalism is really going to turn out to be an anomaly. And we're getting back into the I stand by my press and not by your press kind of view of the world.
So it's actually really a back to the future kind of thing. But what are the implications for, our society as a whole? We've also seen mass media as a glue to keeping us all on the same page, no pun intended, and for having a way of perhaps shared values, shared facts. So what are the implications of this, back to everybody just kind of owning their own place in the media?
Boy, I think it's
I know that was easy, right?
no, it's probably pretty depressing, to be honest. If you look at the early press in the United States, it was an incredibly fractious place. It was full of fake news phenomenon is not something that has cropped up in the last half dozen years.
Yeah, as political scientists, we get that.
Sure. The very first publication, very first newspaper in the United States, which lasted exactly one issue, it had completely fabricated news stories in it. So literally from the very beginning, a newspaper called Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic. So I think it's a little bit scary that we don't have that common ground anymore, that there's not that shared set of facts. But I think, as Jay was saying in the introduction about the decline of institutions, I think the decline in trust in the press really is the part of that larger decline in institutional trust.
So if it's all very fractured right now, and what I listen to or follow is not what you do, and it's not what anybody else does. We sort of have our silos. Can we survive? I mean, thinking obviously current times, Donald Trump didn't create this, but he certainly fueled it. I was watching on the news last night, the InfoWars court case. How do we function in this silo mentality? And is that worse than it was when you're referring to the fractured media from eras gone by?
I would say, Lee, the thing that scares me most is the sort of active push to fuel distrust in media. The Washington Post had a profile last week of Ron DeSantis's press secretary, whose sort of approach to the press seems to be, if you don't follow Ron DeSantis's views, you are not legitimate news media, and starts press conferences by either disinviting what we used to think of as the mainstream press or attacking them. So I think if we get to a point where most people will at least look for journalists who are following certain ethical principles, journalists, whether they're mainstream down the middle view from nowhere journalism or not, participating in the same conversation, even if the conclusions that those publications come to, I think we'll come to a better place. And I think when we talk about fracturing, the idea that all of our news is coming from different places is okay as long as that news tells you where it's coming from, so that you are getting a center-left news source when you read the New York Times, or that you're getting a conservative news source if you're watching Fox News. Not to say we have the one truth, but these are facts. We follow certain standards when we are gathering and processing those facts, but we are seeing them from our point of view, and that's what we're telling you. And I think that actually helps when it comes to media trust in the long run.
What's the attraction of, alternative facts? I mean, I know the world was thought to be flat for a long time. That was probably wrong, but what is the attraction of, to get back to InfoWars, and just this denial of reality.
I don't know that it's so much denial of reality as it is reinforcement of the reality that you want to believe. I ran an honors seminar at Marist a couple of years ago in media bias, where we were looking at whether or not the media does have a liberal bias, and if not, what its actual biases are. And one of the ones that students found over and over again is confirmation bias, that you believe the facts that support the worldview you already have. And that's true for journalists as well as readers. And I think that that really is the appeal of those fake news stories, those alternative facts, the ones that back up the thing you wanted to believe to begin with.
Before we let you go, I did want to get a few numbers from a July Gallup poll and just get your reaction to it. 16% of adults in the US say they have a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in newspapers. Just 11% said the same for TV news. And there's a big partisan divide. There's a shocker. 5% of Republicans and 12% of independents say they have confidence in newspapers. That's the lowest on record. 35% of Democrats say they do. Now, again, we're talking about newspapers and television news. Part of this strikes me as missing, like looking backwards. People aren't getting most of their news from those two sources anymore. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are about those incredibly low numbers.
I mean, I'd leave that in part to the pollsters, but the press critic Jack Schaefer for Politico, looking at those same numbers, said he thinks it's actually in how the question was asked, which I think gets back to what I was saying about your congressperson versus Congress. They were just saying newspapers, television. And I'll tell you in general, I don't have that much confidence in newspapers or television, but if I know a lot more about the particular source that I'm reading, I do have more confidence. And I think that most journalists, even at these publications that regularly get attacked, are doing their best to understand the world on a given day and are not being partisan hacks. They are not starting with conclusions. They're starting with fact gathering. There are all kinds of problems. I don't think, though, that it's what was the number, 16% trust problem. It might be 75%, 80%. But it really takes a critical reader and somebody who's paying a lot of attention to know what's going on. And that's hard because I think media literacy is very low. And that with so many publications putting news out there, it's hard to know which ones really are the ones to trust, which is why I think people long for that, mythological, I may add, but long for that Walter Cronkite, most trusted man in America idea, which also was based on faulty polling.
But good public relations. On the latest, just to continue on the numbers for a second, the Economist YouGov poll for the most trusted news outlet, the Weather Channel at 52%. So being right and correct does not necessarily lead to trust, but they do, I guess, get points for a good effort and somebody we rely upon, even if we don't necessarily think that it's going to be necessarily accurate.
I think it shows the danger in trying to predict anything in any kind of news, if you can't even predict the weather.
Fair enough.
Well, we can relate to that.
Yeah. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. You know where to find me.
Dr. Kevin Lerner, he's an associate professor of journalism and the chair of the Department of Comms Communications at Marist. Thank you so much for joining us. I think you've already suggested another segment we'll have you back for, or at least one, maybe 2 or 3 in this. So that was great. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. You know where to find me.
Have you noticed it's a little hot out sometime during the summer? Yeah.
If this isn't the hottest summer on record, I will be very surprised. You got to get to the end of the summer before they declare that, but I would be very
Yes, I
surprised.
think it's been a little steamy out there, and what one does in that case is one goes to the beach. And then the question is that the polls have asked, going back a decade and more recently, how often do you use sunscreen when you go to the beach? And always, sometimes, almost never. And then a couple of people said they never go to the beach, therefore would not be great. Well, in 2011, 44% said they always do. By 2019, that number had increased to 65%, say they always or almost always wear sunscreen when they go outdoors for an extended period of time or while they're at the beach. This contrasts tremendously when I was a kid growing up, and the idea was to, slap on all the lather and get the darkest tan as you could possibly be. And somewhere along the line, people said this isn't necessarily a good thing for your skin or your health over time. So now
It wasn't sunscreen, it was oil that you were
Yes.
slathering on, right?
So you just baked in the sun, and this was seen as a good thing. The deeper the tan, the better you were. And now, of course, it's a health concern, understandably. I thought this was pretty interesting that 2/3 of the country says they're pretty much doing this. But Jay, I know you have
I was surprised that it's only 2/3 in 2019. The other thing that so there's that's why I said surprised at the start of the show is I thought that's a little surprising. The other thing though, Barb, and we talk about this a lot about what polls can tell us in the past, not only from their results but what they don't ask. We couldn't find a poll prior to 2011 that asked about this. Now maybe we didn't look at every possible combination of questions, and so maybe somebody asked a poll about how deep a tan do you like to get in 1965 when the Beach Boys were on the radio? I don't know. We didn't find that. But if indeed it's the case, that says a lot that it took until 2011 to ask the question. I think that says a lot about how far we've come.
Absolutely, and to become an issue. And as Lee, you noted, I mean, if you went to the beach, you sat by the pool, you actually put, oil on yourself.
You took aluminum foil and you got extra reflection.
Yeah, I think what was it? I know Coppertone was a big brand at that time too, not for their sunscreen, but for their oil. And I think it was what Hawaiian Tropic or something, which was just coconut oil or something.
That smell, I still, if that smell wafts by, I just flash back to 1975. It's crazy.
Yeah, and on the AM radio, if you were playing that as you were literally soaking up the sun, the disc jockeys would actually every 20 minutes or so would say, okay, time to roll over, which meant you had to, turn over so you could get an even tan.
Wow, I tell you, Barb, I wish I was as old as you are to remember all this stuff. Anyway, but a fun fact nonetheless for all of us to shine down upon a ray of light. There's a line in there somewhere. But anyway, until next week, we'll have to leave it at that.
That's it for Poll Hub this week.
Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer.
Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes Greta Stuckey, Mike Bowler, and Will Promiso.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, please consider leaving us a review. Positive reviews help other listeners like you find us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal.
If you have questions for us, tweet them at us at Marist Poll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub.
And with any luck, it will cooperate. Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button.
Click it and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.